Good evening, community. My name is Juan Jose. I spent many years working as a truck driver. I started driving my truck in the 80s and retired in 2005, but all those years on the road left me with countless experiences, some more terrifying than others. However, the story I am about to tell you was the most tragic of them all. I remember that night back in '95 quite vividly. I was with my best friend, who was also my co-worker. We often traveled together in my trailer as the trips were usually very long. Sometimes we drove for days, and he would drive so that I could sleep and vice versa. That night we had been on the road for 2 days, and were supposed to reach our destination in the morning. We were on the highway to Guadalajara, Colima, which was our final stop. We were chatting to keep me awake while I drove. It was around 3 a.m. when we suddenly saw someone at the side of the road, walking in the same direction we were heading. My friend was shocked to see someone out so late at night walking in the middle of nowhere. We couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman because their entire body was covered with a black blanket. He asked if we should stop to offer a ride, and I agreed. I began to slow down, and soon we were very close to what we believed was a person. When we stopped right beside them, my friend asked if they wanted a ride, but the person continued walking without turning to look at us. We could tell it was a woman because her hair hung out from the front of her cloak, although we couldn't see her face. When she didn't respond, my friend insisted, asking if we could help her with anything. Again, there was no response. Then my friend made the worst mistake of his life. Frustrated by her silence, he snapped, "Screw you then." At that moment, the woman slowly turned her head toward us. But it wasn't a woman. It was a skeleton, a skull without eyes, just bone, no flesh. My friend screamed in terror as she stared right at him. I was frozen in shock for about 10 seconds, then I floored the accelerator and sped away. My friend kept screaming, terrified. I was scared too, but I was so paralyzed I couldn't even speak. That was the most horrifying and disturbing thing I've ever seen in my life. Dawn finally broke, and we reached our destination. We delivered the cargo and headed to a cheap hotel to spend the night and try to recover from the fright, as neither of us was at ease. We still didn't know what that thing in the middle of nowhere was. My friend called his wife but didn't tell her anything. He didn't want to worry her. I remember him saying goodbye to her, eagerly wishing for the morning and the road days to pass quickly so he could finally be back home with her and their child. After that, we went to sleep. The next morning, very early, we hit the road again, this time with my friend driving and me in the passenger seat. Everything was going well until suddenly, another truck tried to overtake a bus on the opposite side and caused the worst crash I have ever experienced. My friend, my companion for many years, died instantly. I was unharmed, as was the driver of the other vehicle. My friend was the only fatality of the accident. I started screaming for help until the paramedics and ambulances arrived, but there was nothing they could do for him. What disturbed me even more was realizing that when they pulled me out of the truck and were giving me medical assistance in the ambulance, I noticed we were in the exact same place where that skeleton had appeared to us 2 nights earlier. Then I understood that what had appeared to us was death itself, having come for my friend because he had disrespected it that night. I passed out and didn't come to until I was back in my city. I don't know how I got there. It took me many years to get over that tragic event where I lost my good friend. I continued to drive trucks for a while longer, because I loved it and it paid well, but I always respected those things that are not of our world. I also saw many wandering souls that later vanished into thin air on the highway, but I never stopped to see if they needed help. I just kept going. That's how I spent another 10 years in that job. So that's my sad story. A big hug to everyone. This event happened to me 10 years ago when I was still a truck driver. I was engaged in transporting raw materials to different locations in Mexico. I can't speak for all my colleagues, but one sees many strange things on the road in the early hours of the morning. I must say that both my brother and I have many stories of this sort, but today I will tell you the one that marked us the most and is hard to forget. That night, my brother and I were driving on the highway from Nuevo León to Tamaulipas. We had been traveling for several hours. I don't remember the exact time, but it was well past midnight. We were chatting and listening to music when suddenly we saw in the distance silhouettes illuminated by a bright light. It was almost impossible to see clearly as everything was pitch black, but the large lights of our trucks allowed us to see several meters ahead of us. As we got closer, we realized that the figures were people asking for help. I remember it clearly. It was a man and a woman. She was holding what seemed to be a baby wrapped in a blanket, but the most chilling part was that they were standing next to a completely burned-out van. My brother told me to pull over because we needed to help them. They had a baby. I immediately agreed and stopped just in front of them, a few meters away. The man approached our truck, and I opened the door but stayed inside. From my higher vantage point, I asked them what had happened and if they were okay, given that their van was completely burned. He pleaded for our help, saying they wanted to get home but had no way to travel without giving us more details. I replied, "Of course, we can take you to the nearest town, and you can also use my cell phone if you want to call a relative." He was very grateful and responded tearfully, "Thank you so much. I'll get my wife." He went back, and my brother and I waited in the truck, rearranging everything in the cabin to make space for them, as there was barely any room. When we finished making space and returned to our seats, I checked the rearview mirror because they were taking too long to come back. But there was no one there. My brother looked out and even opened the door to get a better view. He asked me where they had gone. They were no longer there. I got out and walked to where the van had been, but it was gone too. Using my cell phone as a light, I looked around in the darkness, searching everywhere, but there was no trace of them. We got back into the truck, both utterly baffled by their disappearance. My brother, very frightened, insisted, "Let's get out of here." I started the truck and began to drive away. He was sure we had encountered restless souls, but I didn't believe in such things and was skeptical about it being ghosts until 2 days later. We were at a trucker's rest area in Nuevo León, resting and chatting with another driver. We shared our experience, but he wasn't surprised. In fact, he reacted as if he had seen them too. He told us they were a family from Tamaulipas who had been intercepted by organized crime 3 years ago. They were found burned inside their vehicle. It was said the man had been involved in bad dealings, which cost him and his family their lives. They sometimes appear asking for help. Other colleagues and even he himself had seen them, but they knew better than to stop, only to pray that they might find their way to eternal rest. I couldn't believe it. It was very hard for me to accept. My brother immediately said, "See, I told you. We encountered restless souls." To this day, I still remember the man's face with terrible anguish on it. I've never gone through that area again, but I hope they have finally found peace. Hello. This story didn't happen to me. It happened to a friend and colleague of my grandfather. He would always tell this story to me and my siblings because it was quite controversial and famous in its day, and it was real. My grandfather spent his entire life as a trucker in the United States. Although we are Mexican, he loved his job and was almost always on the road. He also had many friends and colleagues. This story begins when one of those friends was driving on State Highway 9 in New Mexico in his truck that evening. My grandfather was also on a trip in his truck, but he was in California. They liked to talk over the radio while driving. It was quite normal. It kept them entertained and they felt accompanied during their journeys. My grandfather was with another colleague who always rode shotgun, but that friend in New Mexico was completely alone. He said that they were talking on the radio and joking around as it was getting close to 8 p.m., and it was almost completely dark, when suddenly, the man told him over the radio that he could see something strange in the distance, way back in the mountains. My grandfather asked what he meant, and he said he saw colored lights in the sky that were getting closer, but he couldn't quite make out what it was. My grandfather and his co-pilot jokingly said that the aliens had come for him, and the man laughed too, but then there was silence on the other side of the radio. My grandfather asked if he was still there and if he was okay, and that man began to say a lot of things, but nothing could be heard, as there was a lot of interference. The voice of his friend was cut off due to radio malfunctions at that moment, and my grandfather couldn't understand anything. He tried to keep communicating with him, but all he could hear from the other side were a series of harrowing screams asking for help. After that, all communication with his friend was lost. My grandfather tried calling him again, but it was completely futile. The man with my grandfather immediately called the police and reported what had happened, although he couldn't specify exactly which mile marker they were at. My grandfather says it was days before his friend reappeared. He left no trace of himself or his truck. The police searched the entire highway, and there were helicopters looking too, but all was in vain. His family was losing hope of finding him alive, but one night the police received a call from a family traveling on that road. They had found a disoriented man lying on the ground at the side of the road who did not speak and didn't know who he was, and also had no identification. He looked very ill. The police went to the place, and that man was his friend, the one who disappeared under those strange circumstances. The police took him to the city and called his family, but the man didn't say a single word. He was disoriented, didn't know who he was, and didn't recognize his relatives. The man never spoke again. They never found out what had happened to him or how he had disappeared, let alone what had been done to him. Although given the state he was in, it must have been something very traumatic, as it left him unable to speak for the rest of his life. My grandfather and many other people in New Mexico, where the case became public, thought it was a case of abduction. It was said that he had been experimented on and had his speech and memory removed so that he wouldn't remember anything that had happened to him. And it all fit more since he had seen those lights in the sky approaching him before he disappeared. That call was recorded, but the police never wanted to release it as they didn't want people to speculate. And who knows, maybe they themselves know what happened to him, but like many other things that happen in Area 51, they don't want us to find out. The man passed away in 2011 but never spoke again, nor was he able to work again, as it seemed he had no awareness. He lived off his siblings for the rest of his life. I hope you enjoyed this impressive and mysterious anecdote. Greetings to all. Hello, this is Raphael speaking. A few years ago I lost my job, and a cousin of mine who is a trucker told me that the company he worked for was looking for more truckers to transport various materials to different states here in Mexico. The only requirement was that you had to own your truck since they didn't have any available. He mentioned he could help me buy or rent an affordable truck to start working, and that the money I invested would be returned within the first few weeks I made trips. I immediately accepted since he was living well and told me the more trips I made, the more money I would earn. That same week, he found me a truck being sold at a ridiculously low price. The truck was in great condition, and after all the necessary inspections, I bought it using my savings. That's how I began my career as a freight trucker. Everything was going well until that night. It was only my second trip, and I remember I was on the highway to Oaxaca, Tehuantepec. It was nearing 10 p.m., pitch dark, but suddenly I heard thumping noises coming from the back, the trailer's cargo area. I turned down the music to listen better, and indeed, the sounds were so loud that I could hear them up front. I couldn't find an explanation. I had checked the cargo myself before closing the cargo door. Obviously, there was no one there, so I couldn't understand what was causing those thumps. I looked for a place to pull over to check. I got out of the truck and walked with a flashlight towards the cargo area, but as I approached, the noises stopped. Upon opening the doors, everything inside was just as I had arranged it. I entered to check thoroughly to make sure no one was there, but I found nothing. Baffled, I locked the doors again and continued driving, as I had to reach my destination on time. Not even 5 minutes later, those desperate, loud thumps started again from the cargo area. This time I didn't stop since I had already confirmed everything was in order. I continued driving non-stop until I reached my destination, though the thumping never ceased. I was very stressed and somewhat fearful the entire journey, nearly causing an accident. On the return trip to Oaxaca, the same thing happened all the way. When I reached my city, I told my cousin what was happening and said I wanted to return the trailer because I couldn't keep driving like this. We went back to the place where we bought it, and this time a woman attended to us. I told her about the incidents, fearing she wouldn't believe me because it was hard to explain. However, seeing the trailer, she shook her head as if to say no, and asked who had sold us the truck. We gave her the name of the person who had sold it to us for a very low cost. She apologized and explained that the truck was not actually for sale. The local authorities had asked her to keep it there because they didn't know where else to put it, but that trailer had been the scene where several migrants died from lack of air, having been locked inside for a week. The truck had been held by the prosecutor's office while they investigated the crime, but eventually, they didn't know what to do with it, and it was left abandoned at the truck business, not belonging to anyone nor officially for sale. My cousin and I were stunned as we listened to the tragic story of those people. Then I understood that the desperate thumping in the cargo area was those poor souls still seeking help. I wanted nothing more to do with trucks, nor did I return to that work. I managed to get my money back and looked for another job instead. Thank you for listening to this sad and tragic story. Good night to all.